A mesa que a gente vai ouvir agora é Memória, Reconhecimento e Reparação, Pensando, Futuros Negros Possíveis. Essa é a forma que a gente imaginou para fechar esse seminário e esses trabalhos de 2 dias. Eu vou chamar no palco a Bianca Santana. Pra cá? Eu pra cá? Bianca Santana é jornalista, mestre em Educação e doutora em Ciência da Informação pela USP, com tese sobre memória e escrita de mulheres negras, autora de Arruda e Guiné, Resistência Negra no Brasil Contemporâneo, Continuo Preta, A Vida de Sueli Carneiro e Quando Me Descobri Negra. É fundadora e diretora executiva da Casa Sueli Carneiro, que compõe a Coalizão Negra por Direitos. Eu agradeço muito de você estar aqui hoje e aceitar esse desafio. Obrigada, Bianca. E eu vou chamar para compor a mesa a Nikole Hannah-Jones, com muito prazer. Nikole é criadora do projeto 1619, vencedor do prêmio Pulitzer e repórter da New York Times. A publicação em livro do projeto 1619, o livro infantil Born on the Water, derivado do projeto, foram imediatamente para o topo dos livros mais vendidos do New York Times. Ninguém encosta o pé no chão, normal. Se fosse eu, ainda está mais curto. O projeto 1619, que foi uma grande inspiração para nós e para o trabalho do Ibirapitanga e também para o projeto Quirino. Cadê o Thiago, que está aqui? Desdobrou-se atualmente em um documentário em 6 capítulos, disponível na plataforma Hulu. A gente vai seguir a mesma dinâmica de perguntas no final. E agora eu deixo com vocês. Obrigada.
Ufa! Gostaria muito de agradecer pelo convite para estar aqui. Muito obrigada, Luciana. Muito obrigada, a equipe toda do Ibirapitanga. Muito obrigada, Nikole. Obrigada a vocês que estão aqui também. Dizer que eu estou aprendendo demais nesse seminário. Mas eu também queria agradecer a Bianca de ontem, que escreveu o que dizer. Porque agora eu estou bastante bagunçada, depois da mesa anterior. Obrigada também por isso, Luciana. Bagunçou. Mas agora eu tenho um apoio. É uma alegria muito grande estar aqui para ouvir Nikole Hannah-Jones sobre futuros negros possíveis. Mas eu confesso que eu sinto falta de mais gente nessa roda, Nikole. Gente que tem discutido memória negra no Brasil e que tem construído, principalmente a partir do ativismo negro, nossos futuros possíveis. Para ficar apenas no Rio de Janeiro, eu sinto falta do movimento negro unificado, e aí vale uma saudação e uma salva de palmas ao Iedo Ferreira, que acaba de fazer aniversário. Sinto falta do IPCN, do IPAfro, que está aqui também, tem algumas pessoas do IPAfro por aqui, CUT, Crioula, Rede de Historiadoras e Historiadores Negros. Mas esse é um seminário com um recorte, com limitações de tempo e espaço. Eu acalmo meu coração, sabendo que estamos lá, como um movimento negro, na Coalizão Negra por Direitos, sonhando e construindo futuros. Eu só não podia deixar de registrar. Assim como eu não posso deixar de registrar a importância deste seminário. Como disse a Ju Borges, agora há pouco, as vitórias que a gente tem, e elas são muitas, elas são fruto do trabalho coletivo do movimento negro brasileiro. Por isso é importante fazer esse registro e essa marcação. Nikole, do seu livro, 1619, derivado do projeto homônimo que você coordenou no New York Times, eu destaquei um trecho que eu queria compartilhar aqui com todo mundo em uma livre tradução feita por mim. E aí já fica a dica para as editoras presentes que podemos ter traduções melhores publicadas no Brasil. A crença de que as pessoas negras não eram meramente escravizadas, mas uma raça escrava, é a raiz do racismo endêmico que não podemos purgar desta nação até os dias de hoje. Se as pessoas negras nunca puderam ser cidadãs, se elas foram uma casta apartada de todos os humanos, então eles não foram sujeitos dos direitos constitucionais. E o nós, do nós o povo, da Constituição dos Estados Unidos, não era uma mentira. Eu gosto muito desse trecho, porque ele escancara o quanto o Estado norte-americano, assim como o Estado brasileiro, foram constituídos como Estados antinegro. E como a democracia que não garante nossos direitos é uma democracia para quem é cidadã ou cidadão, não para nós. Se essa é a premissa do Estado, como tantas vezes a gente tem ouvido hoje, eu queria te ouvir se para você há caminho de reparação no Estado.
Okay, sorry, I had to write that down. Also,
Do you have a mic?
oh,
Yes.
I was listening so much to the translation. Okay. My apologies. And also, my apologies for being so awkward in this chair. My legs are too short for me to sit back, so I couldn't be up here dangling my legs. First, I just would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation that is happening all across the diaspora right now. The reparations movement is very old, beginning here in the 1700s, beginning in the United States in the 1700s, and I think we are seeing the most positive political landscape for reparations that we have seen in my lifetime. So it's important that we don't have these conversations in isolation, because our liberation is tied to each other, and if we can find success in one place for reparations, that sows the seeds for success everywhere else, which of course is also why they fight so hard against even the tiniest bit of reparations, because once you achieve it somewhere, then it takes away the excuse not to achieve it other places. Also, I really have to acknowledge the panel that I had the honor of sitting through with the rest of you, Bianca, who I just met, who's going to take me to Salvador in 2 days.
Luciana.
Oh, Luciana, sorry, not Bianca who invited me. I apologize. Juliana, who I met right before the COVID shutdowns. My last trip before the COVID shutdowns was to Brazil. And every time I hear you speak, I just get edified. You're just brilliant. And I don't know if Monica is still in the room, but every Black woman in the world shares that pain. Every Black woman in the world can name a loved one that she has lost. And every Black person in the diaspora knows that our stories, the oppression that we're fighting against are all intertwined. And I just was reminded of my own family members who we've lost to violence, and feeling that connection of the heart. So now I'll answer your question. One, I think what we're trying to do here, talking about memory as a way to get us to the future, is so important, because in the beginning of the 1619 Project book, I talk about, as a child, never seeing anyone like me in the story of America. Learning the history of a country that erased us. And they would mention slavery because we had a civil war, so you have to discuss slavery to discuss the Civil War. And then Black people disappear for a century, and then Dr. Martin Luther King has a dream on Washington, and everything is fixed, and then we disappear again. So at the same time that I'm not hearing about us in the past, I'm also not seeing us in the future. So I'm reading books like the famous book 1984, and Black people don't exist in that future. So we're erased from the story of the past because they don't want us to exist in the future, right? And we know this because of that quote that you read from the text. So it was interesting to hear you translating a translation back in my ear, right? So you're translating and it's being translated back, and it was very good, both translations. So if we understand that the United States and Brazil were founded really as slaveholding republics that we'd like to think of these places as democracy, but if we believe democracy actually means one person, one vote, clearly the United States didn't have democracy until 1965, and we achieved what democracy we have because of Black resistance. So that quote that you read was actually from a famous United States Supreme Court ruling called Plessy v. Ferguson. And that ruling was a ruling to determine whether the United States could legally implement racial apartheid. It's known as separate but equal. And so what the court rules was that you can segregate Black people, descendants of slavery, in every aspect of American life, as long as they get equal treatment. So of course we know segregation has never been equal. And so in making that argument, what the court rules is Black people are not just slaves, but come from a slave race. So this is turning slavery from a condition, right, a condition that someone has placed you in, to innate to your character, to genetic, to the fact that if you were of African descent, you were into a race that was inferior to white people, and therefore slavery was your natural condition. And what it also said in that ruling by the Supreme Court, the majority on that court were themselves slave owners, was that Black people had no rights that a white man need respect. So the highest court in the land is saying that by virtue of being African, you are a slave race and you have no rights that a white man need respect. And I was thinking actually, Juliana, when you were talking about the rule of law. So then we have to understand, how was the rule of law architected for Black people? What does the rule of law mean for Black people? The rule of law means the law is used to deprive us of rights, not secure our rights. That the law is used to ensure that we don't have equal access to education, to jobs, even to our own bodily autonomy. So when they passed the free womb laws in Brazil and in the United States, which were gradual emancipation laws, the laws are being used to determine whether our children will be born free or enslaved. So what does the rule of law mean to us? And how can we trust the state built upon that? Now, I'm gonna get to the point, but just listening to you brilliant women has my mind kind of all over the place. So getting to the question of, can the path through reparations come through the state? So you read that quote. Sorry, I'm like hearing the Portuguese translation in my ear, and it's very distracting. When you think about this idea that Black people are slave raised, what is really being said is Black people are not meant to be part of a democracy, right? Black people were brought here as laborers, not to be citizens. This was not a choice. This was not an immigration. Black people were not to be a part of a democratic project, not here nor there. And when we talk about land, right, and the value, land is worthless without labor. So yes, the value came from the free labor, which was necessary to cultivate the land to achieve all of these riches for individual white people, but also the European colonial powers. So if we start from the premise that we were not meant to be citizens, that we were not ever meant to be a part of the democratic process, and yet we are here, right? We are here, we have gained our citizenship through our own bloody resistance struggles, and we have to achieve reparations through the state. So one thing that I understand about Black people is Black people have to believe that the impossible can be made manifest. That our entire existence, the fact that we are in this room, people who were not supposed to live outside of slavery, people who are not supposed to take part in the society that we built, that we are in the United States, 40 million people of African descent. We are the greatest testimony to the fact that we will exist. And if we are to exist, then we have to fight for things that we don't think we will ever see. How many people during slavery, abolitionists, fought to end a system that no one could have imagined they would actually be able to end? When we think about the Black rights struggles here and the Black rights struggle in the United States and the Black rights struggle on the continent, the ability to achieve independence, the ability to achieve equality, at least in the law, were things that 10 years before I was born, many people did not think would be possible. So we have to both agitate outside of the system, but also not cede the ground of the country that our ancestors built. We are here, even if there are some of us who have the ability to leave and go somewhere else, most of our people never will. So we have to believe that we can provide that pressure to force the state to make repair for the harm that the state did. But I also think reparations it's an unpayable debt. So the state is not enough. Every private corporation that benefited from slavery needs to pay. Individuals, right? So no one wants to inherit the debt of slavery, but people don't seem to mind at all that they are inheriting the wealth of slavery that they didn't work for personally, right? So I think everyone has a different role to play in pushing for the different aspect of reparations that must come about, but we can't ever cede the state. The state, to me, owes the biggest debt.
Muito obrigada. Se vocês quiserem ir mandando as perguntas de vocês no caminho, façam isso, por favor. Você é jornalista, assim como eu, sou jornalista também, e nós somos menos sérias que os historiadores e historiadoras. E tenho várias e vários aqui presentes. Tiago Rogério também riu, porque também se reconheceu, não é? Nesse lugar de quem populariza pesquisas, algumas delas feitas por nós, porque nós também frequentamos os arquivos, mas muitas delas feitas por mais pessoas que fazem com mais seriedade esse trabalho. Como é isso de popularizar a informação documental, mas também das entrevistas, feita com metodologia, mas muitas vezes escapando um pouco de uma determinada formalidade para contar nossas histórias para mais pessoas? Você pode falar um pouco da importância, mas também dos limites dessa prática?
Okay, so how many historians are in the audience? Okay, so don't take offense at this bad joke that I'm about to make. Which is, so I am a history nerd at heart, and I started studying history from a really young age because history calmed me. Because I would see my Black world and wonder, why does our neighborhood look like this? Why do the people in my family work so hard but never seem to be able to get ahead? And starting in the second grade, I was part of a school integration program that bused me from my Black neighborhood school all the way across town, 1 hour each way on the bus, to the richest, whitest school in the neighborhood. And every day, those kids' parents, I would see we all had to get on the bus to go home. They walked to school. And I would see the white kids' parents come home and pick their kids up in their nice little dress and suit. And then I'm seeing the parents in my neighborhood coming home from the meatpacking plant, right? With blood on their clothes, or like my uncles where they would work all day to the point where they couldn't make a fist with their hands because their knuckles were so swollen. And I was like, their parents cannot be working harder than ours. Right? I'm not saying white collar work isn't hard, but it's not. Right? And so in my head, I'm trying to figure out, well, they're telling us that our neighborhood looks like this because we don't want to work. And they're telling us that our houses look like this because we don't care if our property looks nice. And yet my uncle is spending ungodly amounts of money at the rent-to-own because he can't afford to buy the furniture to make his home look beautiful. Then when you study history, you realize, oh, this was all created. Oh, it has nothing to do with Black pathology. It has to do with, in America, we had redlining, where the government wouldn't give home loans in Black neighborhoods. We have all of these policies. So I became really, really interested in history because when I learned history, a world that didn't make sense started to make sense. But this is where the joke comes in. I actually wanted people to read what I wrote. Right? So you study history, but I said it's a bad joke, but most people don't read lengthy history books, right? I'm a history nerd. I don't care how exciting or how dry. I want the information, and I love reading history. I even love reading the way historical texts are written. But that's a different type of language. It's an academic language. It's changing. And actually, some of my favorite historians write for a popular audience. I mean, they're in the book, right? But coming up, I really was like, I want to be able to translate history for a regular person like my family members who are not reading that, but they want the information. And more than that, I wanted to be able to show, now in the field of historiography, they call this presentism, right? Which is saying the present is being impacted by this history. Now, I just think that's the way Black people practice history, but I've learned since the 1619 Project came out that a lot of white historians think we should talk about history as if it's divorced from the present, as if it has nothing to do with the society that we live in now, but that never made sense to me. So I wanted to be a journalist that used history to help us explain all of the racial inequality we see. Because much like Brazil, the United States is a country that is willfully, intentionally ignorant about its past. They don't learn the white part of their history well. The Black part of our history just gets completely erased. And so you hear, the inability to grapple with a society where everything is divided along racial lines because they have no idea why the history that built that. So I think that the beauty of the journalistic relationship with history when it is truly symbiotic is I couldn't do my work without historians. And historians, those who are not writing for the popular press, want people to engage with the history that they are creating. And they want that history to have relevance to the lives of people. That's why people, to me, read history. It is relevant to their lives. So how does it work is, one, I do my own archival research. I love going into the archives. I love researching. I love reading original texts. And then I try to find what is the modern day phenomena that I'm trying to show. So I'll just give a quick example. One of our many, many police killings in the United States was a young man named Freddie Gray. And Freddie Gray lived in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland was a former slave state, a former apartheid state, and when he was killed in the back of a police car by a largely Black police force, which I'm sure is also not uncommon here. Black people engage in white supremacist systems as well. So much of the news coverage of this killing was superficial. So one, Black people protested for days and mainstream media didn't cover it. When they burned down the convenience store, now every media in the country is all there and they're only standing in front of that convenience store. The rest of Baltimore was not burning, just that convenience store. So one, there's the question of, why are people not protesting with nonviolence? Well, because they tried that shit and you didn't care. Plus, burning down a convenience store to me is not violence. Killing somebody is violence. But then all the stories were just about that moment in time. Why did that happen to that young man by that police department? But if you're Black, right, and this is, I think, the way Black people and white people think about these things. White people tend to think about everything as an individual incident and an individual person. But when you're Black, 1,000 things led to that moment. 1,000 histories led to that moment. It wasn't just this young man in that car. So what I know as someone who studies history was that Freddie Gray grew up in a neighborhood that had been redlined by the federal government, that his city had been sued for violating the civil rights of Black people, that he had been lead poisoned as a child because in the United States, they segregated Black people into the oldest neighborhoods with the oldest infrastructure that had lead pipes that poisoned them. And the data shows that when you get exposure to lead, you tend to do more poorly academically, you tend to be less healthy, and you often tend to get involved in the criminal justice system because it does something to the way that your neurology works. So that's the story I'm going to write. I'm not going to write the story about why did Freddie Gray run from the police and the police killed him on that day. I'm going to write about this entire infrastructure that leads to that moment and our interaction with that. I don't know that the only limitation, I think, on the form is the lack of space. So this is another difference between how historians write and how I write. I make big, broad, sweeping statements, right? I can write in one essay, I'm gonna span 400 years. Historians don't tend to do that, right? Historians can really drill down on something really deep, and we have to go really wide. But I think the benefit of what we do is we are able to then highlight and bring up that history for a common reader or a common viewer, and really reach an audience for mass consumption. And write in a way, I think that is less limiting in some ways because of the form.
Perfeito, muito obrigada. E você escreveu para crianças, né? Que imagino também seja uma forma de popularizar e de formar também para futuras gerações. Então, são muitos produtos derivados de um mesmo projeto. E aí eu queria saber se você tem ideia de quanto custou esse projeto. Porque muitas vezes parece que no Brasil nós somos, sei lá, menos criativas ou criativos, ou temos menos possibilidade, por alguma razão nossa, de construir coisas maravilhosas. E aí eu queria saber quanto custou. Desculpa, Nikole, vocês me chamaram porque quiseram. E ninguém pode dizer que não me conhecia antes. Desculpa.
So I don't actually know. I know how much my salary is. That's about it. I don't know how much it cost. What I will say is the 1619 project was a highly unusual project to be published in a place like the New York Times. And I was keenly aware when I pitched this ambitious project. So one, to be clear, like, I am not, she has the original. I'm not representative of most Black journalists in the United States, right? Most Black journalists in the United States would never have the ability to get support for a project like that. And I think it is the same as here. It's not that the ambition isn't there. It's not that the creativity isn't there. It's not that the ability isn't there. But our newsrooms run in the same hierarchy as society. And we don't tend to be in a position in our newsroom to pitch something like this and get the proper support, to get the proper resources. And we also know that, you know, white journalists pitch big projects all the time that might just do okay. And then they get to do another one. If we pitch a project that does not achieve a great deal of success, not only will we never get a chance to do it again, but every other Black person behind us will not get a chance to do that project. So I talked to my students at Howard University. It's a historically Black college or university in the United States. And I tell them all the time that you can't control anything outside of yourself, right? We are in a racist society. You're going to be judged. People aren't going to want to give you opportunities. You just have to control your own excellence. You have to try to put yourself in a position to be undeniable, even though they'll still deny you, right? You can be undeniable and still be denied. So by the time I pitched the 1619 project, the field of journalism is probably the most self-aggrandizing profession in the world. Like, nobody gives themselves more awards than American journalists. And so if you can achieve a lot of those awards, which is what the editors care about, then you get a lot of freedom to do the things that you want. So I pitched what was an incredibly ambitious project. I knew what the stakes were. The 1619 project is created by Black folks for the New York Times. It is, almost all the writers were Black, the photographers were Black, and we were determined to tell a story about Black people for Black people, understanding who the New York Times audience was. But I said from the beginning, we were going to tell this story in an unflinching way, which is why it's been attacked the way that it has. Had this project run in a Black publication, Power wouldn't care about this project. But to be able to tell this story of Black people and to call America a slaveocracy, to say we were founded on a lie, and that the founding of our country should be not 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, but 1619 when they began African slavery, and to make that argument in the paper of record, that had not been done. And the crazy thing about it, nobody was more convinced nobody was gonna read this shit than me. Because we don't wanna deal with slavery. And this is tens of thousands of words on slavery. But I also knew that on the 400th anniversary of African people being sold into what would become the United States, that we deserved our reckoning. We deserved to have our story told in the halls of power by Black people. And the night before it published, I couldn't sleep. I was terrified that I will have convinced my bosses, my white bosses at the New York Times to put, it was a lot of money, I don't know, it was a lot. It was an entire issue of the magazine. It was a podcast series. It was a special broadsheet of the newspaper. And it's all I worked on for 9 months, as well as a lot of other people. To have gotten those resources to tell a Black story, and if Black people, particularly for me, if Black people didn't read it, I would have failed. And if other people didn't read it, the Times would have considered it a failure. It was petrifying. But the success of the project, to me, showed that there are enough of us who are ready to have a conversation about the truth. That there are enough of us who look at our society and say, this society does not make sense based on the history we've been taught. And who want to build a society that refuses to continue to harm us in the name of that history. And that if you treat people with intelligence, if you're honest, if you're unflinching, and if you center the voices of those on the bottom, we've heard enough. We know all the stories of those on the top. We don't ever need to hear it again. As Frederick Douglass said, my job is to tell the story of the slave, right? That if you do that, people will come to it. And that's the power of what we do. There are activists, but journalism is its own form of activism, because journalists understand that narrative drives policy. That if you don't have the narrative, this is, I think, often the problem of progressives or people on the left, because we're very didactic and we love data and we love like nuance, which just means you want to be intelligent and have an intelligent conversation, right? But that makes it really hard when you are up against people who speak in propaganda, right? Who just say, okay, you want to fix that, but crime, crime, crime. You have to be able to create a narrative that then supports the work of activists and policymakers. And so to me, if we had a narrative of America that, yeah, a couple people did that bad slavery stuff, but wasn't that big of a deal, and we're the greatest country in the history of the world, and even though they were engaging in slavery, they were the first country to end it, which is not true, but most Americans think America was the first country to end slavery. If you believe that, and if you believe that every person in America now has an equal chance at opportunity, and therefore the fact that Black people are on the bottom of everything is just because we are pathological, just because we are inferior, because we don't want better. If you believe that, then you support regressive policy that tries to fix Black people and not fix the country and not fix the systems. But if you can tell a different story that forces you to confront that all of this inequality we see was created, it was structured, it was built, it was intentional, that we put think about a society like Brazil. Think of every resource that went into creating that inequality. The money, the law, the arts, the culture, right? The universities, the educational systems, all of that went into creating the inequality. And when it comes time to fix the inequality, we want to spend 2 days and 5 cents, right? So if you tell a story that says the society we see is not natural, it's not inevitable, it didn't have to be this way, people chose it to be this way, then you empower people to choose policy that fixes society and not people who are not broken. And that to me is the power of journalism as activism and what I was trying to do with the 1619 Project.
Muito obrigada. A sua resposta agora me lembrou um outro trecho do livro que eu não tinha destacado, mas eu consegui encontrar aqui no celular e eu gostaria de ler também na minha tradução. Por séculos, americanos brancos estão tentando resolver o problema negro, entre aspas. Eles têm dedicado centenas de páginas a este empreendimento. É comum, então, pontuar os índices de pobreza entre pessoas negras, nascimentos fora do casamento, crime e presença nas universidades, como se essas condições, em um país construído sem um sistema de castas raciais, não fossem totalmente previsíveis. Mas, crucialmente, você não pode olhar para essas estatísticas ignorando outra, que as pessoas negras foram escravizadas por mais tempo aqui do que estão em liberdade. Com esse trecho, eu tenho vontade de te perguntar se é possível falar em liberdade, quando no Brasil, além do extermínio de crianças, jovens, adultos, idosos negros, a gente tem também pessoas escravizadas. Nós falamos hoje da Sônia Maria de Jesus, Luciana mencionou, uma notícia terrível da última semana que tem se repetido com cada vez mais frequência. Mas eu vou te perguntar uma outra coisa. Eu vou te perguntar sobre os brancos tentando resolver o problema negro. Porque as alianças são necessárias. Acho que ninguém que está nesse seminário tem dúvidas sobre isso. Mas essas alianças entre pessoas negras e brancas para enfrentar o racismo, elas têm sido efetivas? As alianças entre pessoas negras e brancas para enfrentar o racismo, se elas têm sido efetivas.
Okay, so I think the first part of what you were reading was me, one, trying to speak to Black people, because we internalize the way a white supremacist society sees us. And we start to believe that we are the problem. And then on top of that, we are raised in a society that is always trying to fix us. I know that there are similar reports that have been written for more than a century here, just as in the United States, trying to figure out what is wrong with Black people. But as my good friend, Andre Perry, who's an academic in the US says, there's nothing wrong with Black people that resolving racism will not fix, right? We are not the issue, and we have never been the issue, and we shouldn't have to assert that, but we do. And we have to remind ourselves as Black people when we sometimes, you know, I'm always amazed when people say Black people just want to be victims, because I don't know anyone who's harder on Black people than other Black people, right? We don't want to be victims. And in fact, to acknowledge the way we have been victimized too often feels like we are taking away our own agency. So then we blame ourselves so that we can maintain our agency, right? I should have just tried harder. You should have made better decisions. You should have did this. You cannot better decision your way out of a 400-year system of white supremacy on your own. You can't. So when we see these issues and this desire to paint us as the problem, and this is what, you know, Durban from the United Nations talked about, is Black people, no matter where we are, all face the same problems. We are all at the bottom of our society, no matter where we are. There's this, that's the CIA. I should stop laughing, it probably is. This comes from a country that cannot look itself in the face, right? We have countries that want to believe, and America probably more than any country in the United States, or in the world, believes in this idea that it is exceptional. I don't know other countries that really believe in that myth, that they are the only nation founded on an idea of all men created equal, and the man who wrote those words owned 250 people. So how does one grapple with that hypocrisy? You grapple with that hypocrisy by holding on to lies. And by maintaining the degradation of Black people, then justifies the hierarchy that you built. Because then you can say, actually, we're on top not because we did those terrible things. We're on top because we're actually better than you. Because we built this country, and we came up with these ideas, and all you did was pick cotton in a field somewhere. So, one, Black people have to stop trying to solve the problem as if we're the problem. And white people definitely have to start solving the problem like they are the problem, right? They don't actually think they're the problem. And even if you're not the problem, the thing about systemic inequality is you can be a great anti-racist person and you're still going to benefit from the system that was created with or without your consent. So you have to actively demolish that system. So do we need alliances? It's a different question here than in the United States, though both are yes to a lesser degree. So in America, we are 13% population. We are 13% minority in the country that enslaved us, which means we can accomplish nothing without white alliances. Now, what that puts you in, the position that puts you in, though, is always having to compromise and convince enough white people in power to help you achieve and maintain your basic rights of citizenship. I think sometimes other people who come from other Black countries do not understand what that is like in the United States, that we have always have to convince enough people from the same group of people that allowed slavery, allowed racial apartheid. Until a decade before I was born, we had racial apartheid in the United States. They don't like to use that terminology. We call it Jim Crow because Americans love euphemism. But we had my dad was born in a 100% racial apartheid state. My dad was born in Mississippi. It lynched more Black people than any state in the country. So yes, we have to build alliances, and we have to find enough white Americans who also believe in truth, equality, and justice, and I think they exist. But I think that attention is fickle. So we look at 2020, and 2020 was supposed to be this massive reckoning. What has been achieved? Not one police reform at the federal level. Almost no police reforms at the state level. The most basic thing you can do in a society is say, the state should not be able to kill you and face no consequence. That seems like the most basic thing one can ask for. We didn't even accomplish that. Some companies made some pledges to spend a little money with Black folks, and now we found out they didn't even do that. And now we're in a period of racist backlash. So our Supreme Court just struck down affirmative action. We're seeing a tax on voting. We saw insurrection on our Capitol. You all know what that's like. So it puts us in a constant precarious position where I feel as Black people in the United States, there will never be a period where we are not struggling. There will never be a period where we are not having to fight and resist because we are 13% and shrinking in some ways. Now in Brazil, what I love about the trajectory of the Black movement is more and more and more Brazilians identifying as Black and understanding the power, sheer power of number that you have here that we don't have. Now, that's different than having political and economic power, which then still, of course, requires some alliances. And frankly, if we want to build a multiracial democracy, because I think what makes Black people unique is the biggest fear that white people had at the end of slavery was that we would seize power and do to them what they had done to us. But that's not who we are. So if we want to have a vision for a multiracial democracy, then we should always be trying to make alliances with other working people, with other people who are struggling, so that everyone can take part in the fruits of a country that we want to build collectively. So I don't think we should ever not want to build those alliances, but not at the point of compromising the Black rights and equality that we have been trying to achieve. I don't know how much of a problem this is here, but in the United States, you know, we've adapted this lexicon of diversity and inclusion, and it seems to be about everybody but people who descend from slavery and indigenous people. So in doing this, we still have to speak to this specific and singular experience of descending from chattel slavery in a society. and where that puts you in society while also fighting for a true multiracial democracy. Can I just add one more thing to that? This is also a reason one becomes a journalist. I just write about the problems, and y'all have to figure out how to fix it. I don't have the answers, right? I just look to the past, and I get guidance from the past, and I get guidance from our ancestral struggle, again, of coming from people who had no reason. Like, I think about my own personal story. My grandmother, I come from a family of sharecroppers. My grandmother was born on a cotton plantation in Mississippi. My father was born on a cotton plantation in Mississippi. My father's own grandmother had to midwife her daughter because Black people could not give birth in the public hospital in that town. My grandmother worked as a sharecropper, and then when she moved out of the American South into the North looking for freedom, she found that freedom is not to be found in the United States for Black people no matter where you live. And so she was a domestic worker, and then she was a janitor. She died before I graduated from college. And I think about every dream she had that she had to swallow, every ambition, right? She had every type of dream that any other human being would have, and yet lived in a society where she could realize none of them. The best job she ever had was being a janitor for the city at the courthouse. And I can still picture her because she was my grandmama. So I would always be so excited to go down to the courthouse and see her, and she would be washing the window, and I would watch all the people coming in who just treated her like she was invisible. So I'm coming to see this woman of dignity, and people are treating her like she has none. And I think about that all the time, and how she bore that so I could live the life that I live. And she couldn't have ever imagined that her granddaughter would one day be in Brazil, speaking with our relatives, our kinfolk across the diaspora, trying to get our people our reparations. She couldn't have pictured it. This is the audacity of the people we come from. And so, to me, it is our collective obligation to fight for the dreams our ancestors couldn't live, to repay that debt every day. I feel like I am working to pay that debt that I owe to her, to my father, and to all of our collective ancestors who put us in this room. So I loved when, I think, who was it that said on stage, they talked to someone, was it you, Juliana? And they said they didn't want rest. Right, I so feel that, because people say all the time, you know, how do you keep going? Aren't you so tired? I'm like, there's not a single day that I don't wake up grateful that on my worst day, I write for a living and I talk to people and I read. We come from people who did real work. We come from people right now, right? When I go home, nobody in my family lives like me. I, like probably many of you in this room, I have to send money, money that we'll spend on a nice dinner will keep somebody in my family from being evicted. This is the life that we lead, and this is the obligation that we owe. And this is why I get so angry. Now I'm just going all off script, I apologize, but I just get angry when people think we are not owed. And when people believe that somehow us asking for the debt, which can never be paid, but you can put something on it, right? You could put a couple coins on the debt, that somehow we're asking for something that we don't deserve. So I feel like the time for asking is over. We are demanding now, and we refuse to go home without getting what we came here to get. And I think the beauty of us being in this space together is understanding we're not fighting alone, right? I'm not fighting in isolation in the United States. You're not fighting in isolation here. And when they see our numbers and us making the true demand for what we're going to get, I believe we will achieve it. Maybe I'm old, maybe not in my lifetime, but I'm not even seeding that. So this is just so beautiful for me to be here with you all. And after this, I look forward to drinking some libations with you all as well.
Eu acho que esse é um bom momento para eu ler a ementa da mesa. que eu esqueci. Mas é bom, porque a gente reaterra, né? Traz a conversa para esse lugar. O título é Memória, Reconhecimento e Reparação, pensando futuros negros possíveis. E eu já te agradeço demais por essa por essa intervenção que você acaba de fazer, por trazer esse futuro negro possível, que eu confesso para você que eu tenho tido bastante dificuldade de sentir. E aí a ementa, preparada pela curadoria, é muito bonita, porque começa com uma epígrafe da Beatriz Nascimento, que foi uma importante pesquisadora e ativista negra aqui no Brasil, assassinada vítima de feminicídio. Ela foi morta em 1995. Mas o trecho selecionado é o seguinte: a memória são conteúdos de um continente, da sua vida, da sua história e do seu passado. Como se o corpo fosse o documento. Não é à toa que a dança para o negro é um momento de libertação. E aí abre aspas na Beatriz para convocar o galo de luta, que de repente até os brancos vão saber dançar. Fecha o parênteses. O homem negro não pode estar liberto enquanto ele não esquecer o cativeiro. Não esquecer no gesto que ele não é mais um cativo. Essa é a epígrafe selecionada da Beatriz Nascimento, belíssima. E aí o texto preparado pela curadoria. Em 2001, lideranças negras e chefes de Estado presentes na Conferência de Durban deram 2 passos importantes em direção a uma agenda global, igualitária e antirracista. Acordou-se que enfrentar o passado seria a condição fundamental para que diversas sociedades fossem alicerçadas em valores de igualdade, solidariedade e justiça. Reconhecia-se que as políticas de reparação, além de seu caráter simbólico, também envolviam políticas públicas de combate à pobreza, com investimentos nas áreas de saúde, educação e renda para a população negra. Resultado de décadas de militância do movimento negro brasileiro, as políticas de ação afirmativa, como a política de cotas nas universidades, os programas específicos de saúde para a população negra, a lei que institui obrigatório o ensino da história e cultura afro-brasileira, são exemplos de políticas que vieram na esteira dos compromissos estabelecidos em Durban. O afrofuturismo e os estudos do pensamento negro radical refletem sobre a interrupção de futuros negros imaginados e a necessidade de pensar o amanhã em conexão com o presente e o passado. Após 22 anos da construção dessa agenda, essa mesa tem como objetivo refletir sobre o futuro das políticas separatórias, considerando o papel do Estado e dos movimentos negros. Talvez valha dizer também das narrativas. E aí eu posso te pedir para comentar esse mar de informações boas.
It's a great summary. Oh, you want more than that? I mean, one, I don't think we can understate the importance of Durban and the importance of Durban towards legitimizing for the people who needed it to be legitimized, the reparation struggle, for laying out that the struggle for reparations, for Black freedom, is connected across the diaspora, and for making the demands that what we're really calling for is an entire restructuring of society. That a society built on a caste system that allowed human beings to be categorized as property, that tentacles reach into every aspect of society, that you simply cannot repair, you have to rebuild. And I think what's important to me in thinking about, and I agree, so I'm, people call me pessimist, I just think I'm a realist. I'm I'm not a person who tends to be hopeful, though I will contradict myself because I'm human and that's what we can do. But we do have to imagine a future that doesn't look like this. We do have to be able to feel that we are working towards the society that we all deserve. And I'm reminded of this quote I read in doing some research for a paper I'm working on right now. And it said that abolition was the beginning of the work toward liberation, not the end. And we've tended to think and lived in societies that benefit from thinking that once you abolish slavery, you had a clean slate and the work was done. This is an ongoing project to actually achieve liberation, not just to remove the shackles, but to become a truly free and liberated people. So I think Durban helps us create the academic language to do what political grassroots organizers have been doing and have been saying, really going back again to the 1700s and 1800s. And I think that I love that quote, I wrote it down, right? Black people can't be free until they know they are no longer captive. We have to acknowledge and confront the history, but we can't be held captive by the history. We have to tell the truth about the history so that we can imagine a past that lets that go. There is no amount of money, social programming that can ever repay the debt that is owed and the debt that's still accruing. Because what Durban also said is that not only do you have to repair the harm in the past, you have to stop harming now and cease harming in the future. So there's not one aspect of our society that's not currently being harmed right now. So how do we build that future where we're not just trying to repair the harm that was done, but building the future where we are no longer being harmed? I don't have the answers to that. And honestly, I struggle to think that it's possible, especially, again, living in the United States with a country where the day after slavery was already saying black people are owed nothing for 250 years of slavery, where a white majority right now may elect a man who's been indicted in 4 states who is a white nationalist to presidency again. So how can I dream of a different future? I don't know. But I leave the dreaming to people who are more inclined to hope. And my work is really about shame. I'm trying to shame people into doing something different. I'm trying to say, look at yourself. Like, actually look at yourselves and stop being in denial and choose to do something different. And then that's where the activists and those who have hope step into that moment of shame, I hope, and prod us towards the future that we all deserve. But what I really want is a future where our freedom and liberation is not contingent upon them at all. How do we build that future? And I don't know. There's probably some smarter people than me in the room who can help us figure that out. But it's just long past time where our liberation is contingent on the whims of the people who enslaved our ancestors.
Chegou uma pergunta para você, mas antes de ler essa pergunta e pedir para que vocês mandem mais perguntas, eu queria ler um trechinho do Abdias Nascimento, que eu não tive cuidado de preparar antes, então nem é o melhor trecho que eu poderia ler, mas foi o que eu consegui rapidamente aqui no meu celular. Porque Lélia Gonzalez foi citada ao longo do dia de hoje, Beatriz Nascimento acaba de ser nomeada, e acho importante trazer o nome do Abdias, e talvez com um trecho de um texto dele, de 1977, que ele escreveu com a intenção de apresentar no 2º Festival Mundial de Artes e Culturas Negras e Africanas. Foi realizado na Nigéria. Ele apresentaria esse texto, ele foi impedido num momento de regime militar brasileiro com muita proximidade do governo nigeriano, mas ele distribuiu cópias, pelo que eu li desse documento, e essas cópias estão organizadas em um dos livros dele, se eu não me engano, no quilombismo, Elisa, no genocídio negro brasileiro. Muito obrigada, Elisa Larkin Nascimento, aqui, muito obrigada. Porque o Abdias, no genocídio negro brasileiro, ele nos dá as respostas. Enquanto você diz, eu não vim trazer resposta, ou vocês talvez tenham mais condição de dar as respostas, quando eu me sinto assim, eu retomo a leitura do Abdias, porque eu falo, não é possível que ele tenha listado tudo que a gente tinha que fazer em 77 e a gente ainda não fez. Isso vai me dando muita angústia. E vou ler, então, um trecho. Este colóquio recomenda que o governo brasileiro localize e publique documentos e outros fatos e informações possivelmente existentes em arquivos privados, cartórios, arquivos de Câmara Municipal de velhas cidades do interior, referentes ao tráfico negreiro, à escravidão e à abolição. Em resumo, qualquer dado que possa ajudar a esclarecer e aprofundar a compreensão da existência do africano escravizado e seus descendentes. Esse texto me emociona profundamente porque a gente viveu por muito tempo com uma ideia no Brasil de que os papéis todos haviam sido queimados. Teve realmente um ministro da Fazenda, Rui Barbosa, em 1889, que mandou queimar documentos do Ministério da Fazenda. Mas eu, pelo menos, cresci, eu sei que muitas pessoas cresceram com o imaginário de que tudo havia sido queimado. E, em 77, o Abdias estava lá escrevendo para a gente que não foi tudo queimado, que a gente tem que procurar esses documentos, organizá-los e utilizá-los. Ana Maria Gonçalves, uma escritora que eu tive a oportunidade de te apresentar e que falou tão brilhantemente hoje aqui, faz um trabalho maravilhoso em arquivos para construir um romance que, para mim, é o melhor romance já publicado no Brasil e o meu livro preferido, Um Defeito de Cor, que traz a história da Quendé, batizada Luísa, a partir de muitas histórias de mulheres e homens negros que viveram no Brasil no século XIX. E ela constrói esse romance, que é uma ficção, a partir de pesquisa historiográfica e da pesquisa dos arquivos. Muitas pessoas nessa sala, que eu não vou ficar citando, até porque não temos tempo, têm feito esse trabalho de forma muito bonita. Então, também, além de te pedir as respostas, porque, poxa vida, a gente pediu para você vir lá dos Estados Unidos, então a gente quer, sim, algumas respostas, a gente precisa lembrar que muitas dessas respostas foram escritas já por aqui, né? E retomar é algo importante. E agora eu vou fazer a pergunta que tinha chegado. Nikole, você vê o afrofuturismo como um reconhecimento e reparação desse futuro negro possível? Como você vê esse movimento nos Estados Unidos? A pergunta não veio assinada.
Can you repeat?
Yes. Vou repetir em português, tá? Você vê o afrofuturismo como um reconhecimento e reparação desse futuro negro possível? Como você vê esse movimento nos Estados Unidos? São duas perguntas.
So, I think that Afrofuturism in the United States is, in some ways, distinct from reparations. Well, it depends how one is defining reparations. So it is repair, but it is repair coming from inside of us. It is not repair that we are trying to get from the outside. And it is saying we are going to imagine our lives and build our world with or without you. And I think that's very powerful. I'm an Afro-pessimist, but I love the fact that other people are not, because we need us all. And I can maybe be convinced one day. But I think that is distinct from the repair that we are demanding that those who brought our ancestors here make to us. And I think that's always the tension, is we simultaneously, we have to be pushing for what is due to us, for what is going to have the greatest impact on our people, but also not waiting for them and creating our own futures on our own. One thing that I'm spending a lot of time on in the US, and I imagine there's a similar movement here, is really trying to focus on Black institution building. Because what came out of the civil rights movement in the United States is we were forced to build our own institutions during segregation. And then once we got integration, we defined our entire lives and status on trying to get into white institutions. We want to move into white neighborhoods and send our children to white schools, and we want to work at white newspapers, and we want to go to white colleges. And then the whole time, complaining about how poorly they treat us, and how unfair they are to us, and how we can't rise in them. Meanwhile, we stopped investing in our own institutions, in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities. I'm at a point where I feel like I have proven all that I am ever going to prove to white institutions. I'm done proving anything to them. And instead saying that those of us who have resources, I mean, I've never moved out of Black neighborhoods. I've always chosen to remain in low-income Black neighborhoods. I sent my daughter to a low-income Black public school in our neighborhood. I rejected a white university and chose to come at Howard and build a center at Howard University, because I think we do have to find the answers in ourselves. Now, we have a right to work in any space that we want to work in, to live in any neighborhood we want to live in, but maybe we should start questioning why did we choose it? And why do we not instead choose to use the resources we have to build our own and to care for our own? And to me, that is where our Black future lies, is in no longer defining our status and our stature by spaces that degrade us, and in saying actually the best place for me is with my own.
Tem um pedido para você falar um pouco sobre Ida B. Wells e a importância dela para você.
It's hard for me to talk a little about Ida B. Wells. So how many of you have ever heard of Ida B. Wells? Okay, until a few years ago, most Americans did not know her either, which was, to me, a grave tragedy. So Ida B. Wells is my spiritual godmother. If you happen to follow me on Twitter, I pay homage to her. It's Ida Bay Wells. Her middle name was not Bay. That's just my little Black American thing. So Ida B. Wells was a woman who was born right around the period of emancipation, born into slavery, and who would go on to become one of the greatest investigative reporters, activists, and suffragists in the United States. She was born at a time when Black people had no rights, and then achieved some rights during our period of Reconstruction, and then watches as we lose those rights again at a time when women couldn't vote, no matter their race, and she was not even 5 feet tall. She was extremely sassy. She did not suffer fools, which I admire. And she begins working as a journalist, and then her friends get lynched. She's living in Memphis, so she was born in Mississippi. She's orphaned as a child, raises her siblings to keep, she's orphaned at the age of about 16 years old, raises her own siblings to keep her family together, moves to Memphis, and this will tell you something about her. So she was working in a segregated Black school, and she starts writing newspaper articles about how the school was not paying teachers the same amount as the white schools, and how the kids weren't getting the same resources. Now, how many of you would publish articles against your own employer? She got fired. Right, but that tells you the type of woman she was, where she was going to tell the truth even if it cost her. And so Memphis at that time was actually a place where Black Americans were achieving a lot of success out of slavery. Again, like, this is why the you always have to ask, who do the narratives serve? So the narrative out of slavery is, and even now, is that look how far Black people have not come. But I like to focus on like the remarkable progress that people who had been enslaved for 250 years make at the end of slavery. Black people are owning businesses, they are founding their own schools, they're founding their own churches, there's a Black middle class in Memphis, and that makes white people who are used to Black people being on the bottom very mad. And so a good friend of hers owns a country store, and it's not too far from a white-owned store. And the white store owner gets mad because Black people are going to the Black store because he treats them with respect. So they go to attack him. He defends himself. One of the white men get killed, and they lynch this upstanding Black citizen and his friend. And that changes Ida B. Wells' life, because until then, the narrative about Black men was they were being lynched because they were raping white women. Now, just to be clear, even if that were true, that is not a justification for lynching in a society that is allegedly believes in the rule of law. Lynching was extrajudicial, meaning people didn't have an opportunity to be tried or convicted. They were lynched by a mob. And Ida believed that, as most Black people did, the justification for lynching, until her friend gets lynched. And then she sees that Black people were being lynched for what she said, not for crimes, but for achievements. And that's when she came to understand that lynching was an economic crime, that lynching was a way of destroying Black wealth, of destroying Black people who had achieved success, of sending a message to other Black people, right? You lynch because it is public and is an act of terror. So she would go on to become, she writes about this lynching, and she says, not only are white men lynching for economic crimes, but that often when they're accusing a Black man of rape, it's a consensual relationship that a white woman wanted. And if you know anything about the American South at that time, you could not say that Black men and white women were having consensual relations. So her newspaper is burned down, and she becomes a refugee. She cannot return home, and she wouldn't return back south for about 40 years. I said, sorry, that was a lot, y'all. I love Ida B. Wells. But the long and the short of it, she helps co-found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, of course, the NAACP. We all think of W.E.B. Du Bois as a founder because Ida B. Wells was a woman, and a woman who didn't stay in her place. She was kind of written out of that narrative. She was a suffragist. She fought for the right to vote. She fought white women who were trying to keep Black women out of the suffragist movement, and she fought Black men who were trying to keep Black women out of the civil rights movement. She was the original intersectionalist, an overall badass. I don't know if that translates. Does that translate? I cuss a lot, y'all. And a woman who, because she refused to stay in her place, this is a woman, like her, she hyphenated her last name in the 1800s, right? She was Ida Wells Barnett. She postponed her own wedding like 5 times because she had work to do and she didn't have time to be getting married to this man who was actually a great man. And once she had her children, she would take her baby when she went to investigate a lynching. She would take her child with her because she was a working mom. And I just never, growing up, I never saw an example of a Black woman who was doing the thing that I wanted to do, which was to become an investigative reporting. And here was this woman who was born more than a century before me, who challenged every possible system, but who had kind of been erased from history. So I've really spent the last decade working with her family to try to raise her name back up. And we got a street renamed after her in Chicago. We got the first monument to a Black woman in Chicago built to her. And I think she's just such an example again. I just think about when I was a child, had I learned about Black women like Ida B. Wells, how that would have expanded the realm of possibility for me of what Black people not just could achieve now, but what we were doing at the time when they acted like we were doing nothing. And that's when you understand that so much of what we call history, I mean, that's why the word memory is the first word in the title of this symposium, because what we think of as history is not history, it's memory. Ida B. Wells existed. We just don't learn about her. All of this history happened, you just don't learn about it. And then we wonder why, because who shapes the memory of a country? It's the people who have power. And what do they want that memory to tell us? They want that memory to justify the power that they have and to justify the hierarchies that we have so that we don't challenge them. So when you learn a different memory, then you imagine a different future. And they don't want the future that the people in this room want to imagine.
Você falou da importância de ver uma mulher negra que é aquilo que você gostaria de ser. E quando você disse isso, eu lembrei da Sueli Carneiro contando da primeira vez que ela ouviu Lélia Gonzalez, em São Paulo, na Biblioteca Municipal, e que quando ela ouviu Lélia, que aqui no Brasil falou para a gente sobre gênero, raça e classe, né? Nessa conexão, na década de 1970, quando Lélia pontua isso, Sueli do auditório pensa, agora eu sei quem eu quero ser quando crescer. E Sueli Carneiro hoje é das nossas principais referências no movimento de mulheres negras, no movimento negro. Também lembrei do vídeo que o IDPM lançou ontem, hoje, não sei, acho que ontem, já me perdi um pouco no tempo. É um vídeo de uma campanha muito linda, que tem uma criança negra brincando. E ela se veste das referências que ela conhece e de quem ela pode ser. E num diálogo com a mãe, uma menininha negra mostra que ela pode ser uma artista, que ela pode ser uma mulher na política. Não vou lembrar os detalhes todos do vídeo, mas a mãe pergunta, você sabe que você pode ser ministra do Supremo Tribunal Federal? E a menina pergunta, posso, mãe? A gente não tem nenhuma referência. Então, Joel e DPM, também muito obrigada por essa campanha, por esse vídeo. E a importância de termos uma mulher negra no STF, porque a justiça é negra, e como bem lembrou Ana Maria Gonçalves, nós inauguramos o sistema de justiça nesse país, com Esperança Garcia e com Luiz Gama, mas também pela necessidade de termos referência e de construir aquilo que, para nós, é primordial para que exista futuro. Para que a gente possa imaginar futuro, nós temos que estar vivas e vivos. E ouvimos hoje, da Mônica Cunha, essa dor da perda do Rafael e dessa impossibilidade de sonhar por não poder viver. Mas eu estou muito falante, tem mais uma pergunta da Juliana. E talvez seja a última pergunta. Então, eu faço a pergunta dela e depois você tem um tempo também para dizer o que você quiser. Mulheres negras são as mais atacadas nas redes sociais. Mas não só. O projeto 1619 foi atacado. E, particularmente, você, pelo supremacismo branco. Gostaria que você dividisse essa experiência e como vê a potência, a resistência de mulheres negras para estes futuros possíveis. Pergunta da Juliana.
Brilliant question, of course. I would expect no less. So I'm going to say two things. Had the project not been attacked, the project would have failed. Because that would have meant that we told a comfortable story that powerful people were not worried about. Power does not attack things that they are not afraid will subvert their power. So I knew there would be attacks on the project. I hoped there would be, but I could not have predicted what it would become. And it is one thing to have trolls on Twitter attacking you. It's another thing to have the President of the United States or sitting senators, especially a president who stokes violence. There were definitely some dark days, and also keep in mind, these attacks all happened. So the project came out in fall of 2019. The attacks really started in earnest around the beginning of 2020, and then we go into a pandemic. So, and then we have George Floyd. So the racial tensions are even more heightened. And this is when Republicans decided that they were going to use 1619 as a means of stoking the racial backlash. But it was also amazing because that summer, you saw people spray painting 1619 on monuments to enslavers as they were tearing down statues to enslavers. And they were saying, you know, this is a 400-year struggle. They were understanding what they were fighting against. And that was dangerous to people in power. At the height of the George Floyd protests or the Black Lives Matter protests, almost half of Republicans were saying that racism was a primary obstacle for Black Americans. Republicans are the party of individual responsibility, that where Black people struggle is because Black people choose to struggle, and they don't believe that there's any racism outside of just some bad people. And yet, they were even making this connection that there were systems in place. So while there were some dark days, I consumed way too much bourbon, like a lot. I had to stop drinking bourbon when I realized I was putting it in a coffee cup at 3 p.m., so my daughter didn't know I was drinking bourbon. And that's when you realize, you know, and a good friend of mine, the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates is a very good friend of mine, and he's the friend who would tell me the truth even if I hang up the phone on him. Do y'all have any friends like that? Yeah. Right. If they're real friends, then you'll call them back and be like, you were right. And he said, you know what? You say you're doing this work for your people, but you're going to kill yourself. Like, you're not looking good, you're not taking care of yourself, and you will have let these people accomplish exactly what they want to accomplish. And that's when I had to realize that actually I need to take joy in the attacks. Because, right, like that you could pay me no greater compliment than a racist white nationalist president who hates everything that I stand for, feels like he has to talk about my work instead of doing his own fucking work, right? Like, that is a great compliment. And I had to take it in that way, that these people got shook. They got shook just by a work of memory, a work of history that unseats them as the only heroes in the American story and challenges the society that we built. So it's been, I always appreciate, because I always get a question like that. It's always from a Black woman. And I think about the Cumbie Women's Collective, which it was a group of Black women feminists, most of them queer feminists, who meet in 1977. They name it after the Combahee River, which is the place where Harriet Tubman became the first woman in American history to lead a military raid, which you never hear about that either, rescues more than 200 Black people who are in a prisoner of war camp. And they say if Black women are free, then all people will be free, because Black women sit at the center of all oppression. And that is what, when we think about our freedom dreams, we know that it will be led by Black women. In America, in Brazil, Black women are the most progressive voters and thinkers in any community. We vote for community over ourselves. We pick policies. We are both the most victimized by crime, and yet the most likely to be abolitionists, right? We're the ones who work the lowest paid jobs, but are the most likely to say, if people are struggling in other countries, let them come in, even if they will be competing for the low wage jobs that we have. So when I think about freedom, we know it will always be led by Black women. And it's not that we're magic, though we are, but it is that essence of sitting, right? Being on the bottom of everything gives you such an expansive view of humanity that you, to save your children, to save your community, to save yourself, have to try to save the world. We shouldn't have to, but that's what we do. And I appreciate you and all the work that you do.
Muito, muito obrigada, Nikole. Não sei se você quer acrescentar alguma coisa, mas por mim, nós podemos encerrar com essa imagem tão bonita de que o futuro é uma mulher negra, né? Condensando. to show people? If you want to
Hold it up.
Open it. Tell us something about it.
Oh, Lord, okay.
Anything you want.
I mean, this is the original project that published. Oops, sorry.
I can do that. You want to do that for you?
This is, so one, we met on Instagram or Twitter? On Twitter. And this is our first time meeting in person. But she promised me she's not a stalker, so it's okay. So this is the original project that published in the New York Times Magazine in 2019. This, on the cover is the water at Point Comfort, where the first Africans were brought on the White Lion and sold into America. And I went and stood on that land. There's actually now, at this fort, there was a 400-year-old oak tree that was there at the time of the landing. And they took a sapling from it and named it after me and planted it on the soil there, which is kind of amazing to think that there's something that was there when our ancestors landed. But my favorite part of this whole thing, so this is the New York Times Magazine now. So we know who works at the New York Times. But when you opened it up, all you saw were descendants who created this. And that's like my favorite part, is to be able, never has a magazine of the New York Times been written almost entirely by Black folks and people who descended from slavery. And then this was the broadsheet that came out. This is an old slave bill that's advertising our ancestors being sold. And we worked with the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. So we had every museum to every type of people except Black people. We even had a Holocaust museum, and the Holocaust did not take place in the United States. Ours was the very last museum to get built on the mall, and it is the best. If you ever get a chance to go to the museum, please do. So we worked with them to tell the story of slavery through objects in the museum. I really am proud of this. I love when people bring this up. The most beautiful thing was, most people didn't know this was coming. So they went in their New York Times, and they opened it up, and they saw the blackest thing the New York Times has ever made, and I did that. So. And I dropped the mic literally.
Muito obrigada, Nikole, muito obrigada. Lógico. Como é seu nome, por favor? Como é seu nome? Kátia, muito obrigada, Kátia. Muito obrigada a todo mundo. Muito obrigada, Ibirapitanga. Obrigada, Luciana Brito. Parabéns.